Good afternoon. My name is Ron Eaglin, and I'm the president of Morehead State University. I am pleased today to welcome each of you in the audience and those watching on KET Star Channel to this fifth session of our 7-part symposium on the future of teacher education. We sincerely appreciate the support of KET in the production of these programs. We are grateful to the members of the University Teachers Education Council who are sponsoring this symposium in an effort to gather information on this important subject. Morehead State University has been training teachers for more than 100 years, and we are very proud of the thousands of alumni out there in America's classrooms. Our teacher education program has the highest accreditation possible, and we believe our faculty members are doing a good job of preparing tomorrow's teachers. Teacher education is at the top of our agenda because we realize that today's teachers are facing very different challenges than those who entered the field just a few years ago. I am very proud that almost 50 of our faculty members from a variety of academic fields are here again today as part of their commitment to educate themselves on this important topic. We are seeking information and ideas on the national, state, and local levels because it's important to be able to make informed decisions about this important topic. At this time, I invite Rosemarie Gold, our Director of School Services and Teacher Certification and a member of the Teacher Education Council, to introduce our guest presenters.
Thank you, President Eaglin. On behalf of the University Teacher Education Council, I'm quite honored today to have the opportunity to introduce our guests to you. I would like to ask that each of you stand as I call your names so our audience will be familiar with your names and faces. Here today from the Louisville Courier-Journal is the Vice President and Editorial Director. He is the 30-year veteran of the newspaper and worked previously for the Associated Press and the St. Petersburg Times. He has received the prestigious Walker Stone Prize for editorial writing. A UK alumnus who also studied media law at Stanford and was a Nieman Fellow in journalism at Harvard. Please welcome Mr. David Hopp. The Lexington Herald-Leader recently caught our attention, actually it was last fall, with a series on teacher education in Kentucky. We are very privileged today to have 2 of the 3 reporters who researched and wrote that impressive series of articles. The Herald-Leader's state education reporter, who holds journalism degrees from the University of Virginia and Columbia, who has been with them for 18 months, is Miss Linda Blackford. The Herald-Leader's higher education reporter, who is a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Miss Holly Stepp, and she has been with the Herald-Leader 2.5 years. Returning to his alma mater today is a member of the class of 1970 in journalism. In addition to his degree from Morehead State University, he also has a master's degree from Ohio University. He has worked for the Daily Independent in Ashland for 20 years and has been editorial page editor for the last 18 years. He previously worked for newspapers in Gallatin and Clarksville, Tennessee, and in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Please welcome Mr. John Cannon. Each of our 4 presenters will make a presentation, and then as a group, they will entertain our questions. Mr. Hopp, the podium is yours.
Those of you who know Harvard know it has no journalism program and no journalism courses, so you may be confused about the assertion that I did a Neiman Fellowship in Journalism at Harvard. Actually, I did an immersion China studies, so that'll clear up, close, China studies, journalism. I spent some time preparing for this presentation, which is always a mistake. I am better when I'm glib. Facts confuse me. Besides, I'm like everybody else. I already think of as an expert in education. I already assume I know how kids should be taught and how teachers should be prepared to teach them. This is, of course, a great mystery, why we all feel that way. We've all been doctored, but none of us would stand beside the operating table and give helpful advice to the surgeon as he or she takes out an appendix. And yet, just because we've all been to school, we think we're qualified to tell teachers how to do the most difficult parts of their work and to tell you how you ought to prepare teachers, which is sort of silly. But in any case, having admitted up front the fatuity of my giving any advice on this subject, I'm going to do what President Eaglin has asked me to do. I've looked at a lot of material from a new work just published by Gerald Grant and Christine Murray, which won the Stone Prize from Harvard Press for writing on society and education. It's a provocative book called Teaching in America. From that on the one end to the Kentucky Long-Term Policy Research Center's recent publication on teacher preparation. And what Grant and Murray do that's useful in this book, Teaching in America, is offer what I think is a useful version of what the fundamental aspects of teaching really are, which they say are engaging and motivating students and assessing their moral and intellectual growth and modeling a life of learning. If they're right, then, and I think they are right about that much, then the training of teachers ought to be much broader, I think, than it is now, at least in many instances, in many programs. This view of teaching, their view of teaching, makes the teacher into a rabbi, pastor, guru, or at the very least a secular counselor. And if that really is part of the role, a teacher's preparation in matters of values, I think ought to be more extensive and more intensive than I understand it to be. And the methods that can be used to communicate and debate values in the classroom ought to be developed in the education of would-be teachers at a very sophisticated level. What I didn't find useful in Grant's and Murray's new work was the notion that teachers, because they're locked into a hierarchical system and treated as functionaries rather than professionals, their work mandated by an administrative elite, forced to be creative behind closed doors, that these teachers must gain more control over curriculum, personnel, and professional development issues. I just don't find that useful. They say that teachers need more authority to decide who is qualified to teach, what should be taught, and how it should be taught. And I guess my view is that if we've learned anything from the Kira reform effort, it is that educational improvement is a matter of collaboration. The challenge is not to train teachers for militancy and independence, but to prepare them for cooperation with colleagues, administrators, parents, and the communities that they serve. The Long-Term Policy Research Center's report tells us some things that we already know, such as that teacher quality is only slightly less important than socioeconomic status of students' parents and those students' achievement, and that Kentucky doesn't collect enough data to evaluate teacher quality and to track the relationship between teacher performance and student outcomes. We learned that Kentucky teachers have significantly higher levels of graduate education than the national average and score above state and national averages on the ACT college admissions tests, and on average they have higher grade point averages than required by the colleges of education that they enter, and that graduates of Kentucky teacher training programs also score on the core knowledge and skills, and in a number of disciplines they score at or near the national average, although they lag in perhaps a dozen disciplines. Well, this report argues to me that we should dramatically our professional development system, grounding it more solidly in academic content. A lot of people agree with that. You may. And that we should examine and evaluate our teacher training system, particularly in light of subject area preparation, and make some changes. I agree with those suggestions from the Long-Term Policy Center. My confidence is that they point us in the right direction, and that confidence was bolstered when I spent time in the classroom this week as part of my preparation for being here. I watched Geraldine King teach Beowulf to her 8th grade class at Our Lady of Mount Carmel School on New Cut Road in Louisville South End, where I was intrigued. I mean, she more or less dared me to come watch her teach Beowulf to a bunch of hormone cases, and I could not imagine a bunch of 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds sitting still for anything except maybe this week's edition of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But Mrs. K, as the students call her, really had them wrapped. And the material over which she had them wrapped was something other than the latest CD from Insane Clown Posse or some other. If you don't know the name Insane Clown Posse, then you need to reconnect. Mrs. King understood something important about developing as a teacher. She said this to me. She said, "I'm 5'2" and 30 pounds, but I am Mrs. K." She said, "It took me a long time to become that person, but that's who I am." And I think that's really, the more I thought about it, was an important observation. A teacher's real education begins when he begins to teach. "Why Beowulf?" I asked her. She said, "They love the blood and the guts and the gore and the monsters." And I said, "No, really, why Beowulf?" She said, "Because I love it. And the kids love it when we are done with it. And I want to show them that they can do it. And besides, you just have to teach what you love." I think the only way to develop that kind of love of particular literature, or the elegance of some kinds of mathematics, or the symmetry of the symmetrical appeal of physics, is to know that subject matter intimately. The only way to develop that kind of love for particular content is to come to know that content intimately. There is absolutely no substitute for the confidence and the authority with which a teacher teaches something that he or she loves. Beyond that, teaching is more art than craft, I think. We can give teachers a bag of tools, and we should. They ought to be good tools. But how they use those tools will depend upon their own intuitions, their own prejudices, their own inspirations, their own devotions. I remember some really wonderful research that I once read which documented the relentlessness with which most teachers call upon those whom they expect to give an acceptable answer. This was really a devastating insight to me. This research revealed the persistence with which teachers tend to seek to draw the right answer from those from whom they believe they will get it eventually. The classroom dialogue, this research suggested, is dominated by those who are assumed to be competent. And given the prejudices with which our society and the teachers who are part of it are equipped, you know who gets called upon. You know who gets drawn out. And you know who doesn't. Which means that some of the very kids who most need to be included are not. Some of those who most need the validation of finally answering correctly are excluded from the effort. Get there. You can teach teachers from morning until night how to overcome teachers from morning to night how to overcome this problem with sustained attention to better pedagogical tactics. You can tell them how to approach the problem from a tactical standpoint but they won't change their behavior unless they believe it's there and unless they believe that it's destructive and unless they believe it's critically important that they change. This is at bottom a question of values, and as I've said, I think we spend too little time concentrating on values in the education of teachers. Mrs. K has strict rules, and they're posted behind her desk, 5 of them. Number 1, enter quietly. Number 2, prepare for class. Number 3, chat softly. Number 4, be seated. Number 5, come to order when asked. But when the class actually begins, look out. I mean, she stalks her students, reading aloud from the ancient Beowulf text and demanding answers. And every time she reads the name Beowulf, the class has to shout out, "Our hero." And every time she reads the name Grendel, they have to hiss, quite shortly, a short hiss. By the time she gets to line 20, the warriors are all reclining around the mead hall, sleeping it off. These guys really know how to party, she observes to the class. Now, where in a teacher's educational program does a line like that come from? By line 30, Grendel shows up and breaks down the door and grabs a few people for dinner. And I mean that literally, grabs some people for dinner. And Ms. K asks the class, wouldn't you think they would invite him to the party after 12 years? No wonder he wasn't happy. And one student objects and he says, he didn't have to kill them. And Ms. K shoots back, he's a monster, that's what he does. My question is, where in a teacher's education do they teach him or her to be that quick? At the end of the lesson, young Matt Coleman wants to know how come the villain is dead already and the poem isn't half finished. Grendel's arm by this time has been nailed to the wall. That's a good question, Ms. K tells Matt. But is he dead? Are we sure? And she lets the question hang there like the trailer on one of those old I'll date myself now, like one of those old Flash Gordon serials I used to watch on television in the afternoon. How many of you think this isn't going to be so bad after all? Ms. K asked the class at the end of the period, and every hand went up. Something good was happening. Teaching is as much art as it is craft. Teaching is as much performance as it is task. Certainly you prepare artists with rehearsal, but their real training begins when they step up on stage. They are trained finally by the audience itself. I think the best training programs are those that at some point confront young teachers with as much honest feedback as possible from students themselves. They're the programs that let beginning instructors see how they're doing, see how the audience of kids in the classroom reacts, not just in the moment, but over time, not just in classwork and test performance, but in deeper ways. That's very difficult to do, maybe impossible. But that, I think, should be the goal. My own 8th grade English teacher, Helen Ritter, left a lasting impression on me in at least 2 ways. In the first place, she was so coercive about it that I can still recite all the helping verbs. Is, be, am, are, was, were, been, has, have, had, do, does, did, may, might, must, can, could, shall, should, will, would. But also, thank you, but I also remember even today how my self-confidence improved and my spirit soared when she held up this finger-touching detail on a UN flyer like this, just that little piece of it, and asked the class if anyone recognized it. And, you know, unfortunately, I was one of those types, and I was the only one waving a hand, and I said, it's the Sistine ceiling. You would have thought that I had solved the riddle of the ages. And she let me know that, and I've never forgotten it. Thank you very much.
I appreciate David's comments. I think I'm going to go home and read Beowulf because I don't remember being that interesting. But then I didn't have Mrs. K either, or David. I'm glad to be here today, and it's always good to visit the university where 29 years ago I received a Bachelor of Arts degree and earned a certificate to teach in Kentucky's public schools. However, unlike many of my classmates, I did not enter the teaching profession. As a matter of fact, those who did are now retired. That's the one thing I'm envious about them. But instead, I went on to earn my master's degree from Ohio University and have been employed as a print journalist since 1971. I'm certainly no expert on education, but I am an editorial writer, so being an expert and knowing what I'm talking about has never stopped me from expressing my opinions, which is what I'm going to do today. With the exception of a few sessions as an editorial writing and a career day appearance here and there, I have not taught below the college level since my student teaching days at Coles Junior High School in Ashland in 1970. However, as a husband of a career educator and as the parent of now grown children who have received both the benefits of great teaching and the negatives of lousy teaching, I am deeply interested in quality teaching. And we at the Daily Independent have an intense interest in the quality of schools in the region in which we serve, as all citizens should who care about the futures of their communities. Just like good reporters, and not we editors, make great newspapers, great teachers, and not principals and administrators, make great schools. We all have an interest in attracting the best people into the classroom, giving them the tools and the encouragement to do their jobs, duly rewarding the best and weeding out the worst, and providing the incentives to keep great teachers in the classroom instead of kicking them upstairs to an administrative position where they may not be well suited. Much of what I say here today represents my own opinions and not those of the new management of the Daily Independent. However, unlike on other subjects, Bill Clinton, for example, the members of the editorial board are mostly in agreement on education issues. And I commend Morehead State University for the approach it is taking and what could lead to systemic changes in the way it trains teachers. When Education Commissioner Bill Cody released almost 24 proposals for improving teacher education, the Independent editorialized that his ideas were a good starting point in what should be a vigorous public discussion on how to better prepare teachers and how to help them improve once they are in the classroom. Then our editorial added, quote, what the state does not need, however, is for schools of education at the state universities and the Kentucky Education Association to become defenders of the status quo instead of instruments of positive change. Too often, schools of education and entrenched teachers and their union have become obstacles to change instead of forces for it. The very process that we are participating in today indicates to me that Morehead State University, which first gained and grew and prospered as Morehead State Teachers College, intends to be part of the solution instead of the problem. Now, Dr. Eaglin said we shouldn't do too many anecdotes, but I do have one. Well, I'm fairly certain that Morehead State's teacher education program has changed quite a bit in the 30 years since I was a student, or at least I hope it has. There were certain things about my personal experience that I think were indicative of the problems that existed then and may still exist now. One is that there was a general view on campus that the required education courses were Mickey Mouse courses, a good way to help one's grade point average. And from my experience, that perception was fairly accurate. It certainly helped my grade point average. Well, they did. But that shouldn't be. Teacher education courses on the graduate and undergraduate level should be as demanding and as challenging as any other professional training course on campus. At Morehead, I did not major in journalism. We didn't have a major in journalism then. Instead, I majored in speech and drama with minors in journalism and history. So I was qualified to teach speech, drama, journalism, and history. So what did I do my student teaching in? English. So, as a teacher, I was teaching out of my field of expertise. Go figure. But I was on the junior high level. And if we are to believe the statistics, it doesn't seem to matter whether much on the junior high level whether teachers know anything about the subjects they are teaching. I do think I did know something about English. I did speak it and write it. But nevertheless, I was not qualified to teach it. My student teaching experience taught me that I did not possess the right stuff to be a great teacher. However, the same experience that convinced me that I should seek a non-teaching career earned me an A from Morehead State University. In fact, I think most of my fellow student teachers also received A's, with the exception of the really lousy and poorly prepared ones, and they got B's. Like I said, Mickey Mouse and a disservice to the future teachers of Kentucky. To be brutally honest, I can't think of one thing I learned from my supervising teacher. She just let me go. While I'm not a teacher, my wife spent many years as an elementary classroom teacher, and she now works with science and math teachers throughout Kentucky and West Virginia as coordinator of the Appalachian Rural Systemic Initiative, if that's not a mouthful, at Marshall University in Huntington. In preparation for my comments today, I asked her to have her teachers send me their opinions on their teacher education programs. So most of my research is from talking to teachers and from also them emailing me. And about what they thought were their strengths and weaknesses of their teacher education preparation as classroom teachers. Now, these are all teachers that have been selected by their districts as outstanding teachers to be involved in this program through Marshall. And I want to share with you some of the comments, or a brief synopsis of their comments. Number one, university education professors lack experience as classroom teachers. To quote one teacher, "It's just not the real thing until you do it. I really don't think you can learn a concept until you teach that concept. College gives us the wrong idea about education. We are lectured to, and then we teach and find out that the kids are supposed to experience science. They are supposed to do it. I think college education courses need experienced public school teachers to teach method courses." Another teacher said, "Those professors with all those advanced degrees need to spend some time in the trenches. I don't think some professor who spent 2 years as a high school or elementary teacher 30 years ago can effectively teach teachers. So much of their instruction is pie in the sky." I can share the pain of teachers because I think we have too many people teaching print journalism classes on the college level who have never spent the first day working on a real newspaper. Two summers ago, we at the Independent had a summer intern who was a full professor of journalism at a Maryland university. His department required that he and other professors spend some time working in the field. I commend that university for that requirement. Perhaps professors of education should be required to spend some time teaching high school or elementary classes. Just like the professor of journalism learned that theory tends to go out the window when it's 10 minutes before deadline, education professors may learn that education theory can get lost in the bus duty, bathroom breaks, discipline problems, irate parents, paperwork, and other duties teachers face each day. Unfortunately, it is the outside accrediting process that is so critical to every university that seems to put more emphasis on advanced degrees than on experience in the field, and sometimes that's to the detriment of the students in the college classrooms. Another concern expressed by the teachers were the number of people who are teaching out of their field of expertise. That's a favorite complaint nowadays. Most thought there needed to be more of a balance between core curriculum courses and education courses. I agree. One way to get people with expertise into the classroom is to loosen the requirements for those with years of experience in a field to become teachers. The current trend seems to be to assign a trained teacher to teach a class in which she or he may not have majored in college and hope they can learn enough about that subject to teach it. Why not put an experienced scientist or an accountant in a classroom and have him or her teach classes to make them more take classes to make them more effective teachers. While it's true that a great mathematician may not make a great teacher, which is more risky, putting unqualified teachers in the classroom and hope they can learn the subject, or putting qualified professionals in the classroom and hope they can teach? The least we should expect from teachers is knowledge of the subject area in which they are teaching. That being said, I do have one concern in this area. If requiring teachers to teach only in their fields of expertise leads to some high schools in rural eastern Kentucky districts being unable to offer advanced courses in science and mathematics because they cannot find qualified teachers, then I'm not sure we've gained anything. Instead, we have widened the gap between what schools learn in some districts and what students are given an opportunity to learn in other districts. I remind you that the start of school this year in Powell County was delayed while the district searched for enough qualified teachers. Of course, the inability to find qualified teachers is not the only reason so many are teaching out of their fields. Sometimes the only teaching positions in the field where the new football or basketball coach received his training have been taken up, and they have to assign him somewhere. Anyone who thinks Kentucky high schools do not hire good coaches and hope they can teach is living in a dream world. Also, sometimes those teaching in their fields got their jobs because they knew or were related to the right people. The role of politics has declined a great deal in Kentucky's public schools since Kira, but it has not disappeared. Among the teachers, there was general dissatisfaction with the current student teaching program. While most thought the mentoring programs now in place in various forms in both Kentucky and West Virginia were a step in the right direction, more needs to be done. I believe a year working closely with one teacher instead of just 9 to 12 week period would be a much better learning experience, said one. Make it an apprenticeship or something with both the cooperating teacher and the student teacher receiving pay. Another teacher suggested a 1-year apprenticeship under one teacher with both of them in the same classroom. More care in selecting supervising teachers also was suggested. Sometimes those who are the best teachers are not the ones assigned student teachers. Teachers said they wish they had had more college instruction on effective communication with parents, on national and state education standards, and classroom management skills. Without those management skills, one teacher said it is easy to become bogged down in the routine and never strive for the excellence. There has been a great emphasis on using technology in the classroom in recent years, as well there should be. However, in the rush to put computers in the classroom, we have neglected to give teachers adequate instructions on how to most effectively use computers as a supplement to their classroom instruction. The fact is, many students are more comfortable using computers than their teachers. The internet is a tremendous source of information. It holds the key to great libraries, great museums, and a wonderful world of information. However, it is also the source of some of the world's worst information. And I'm not just talking about pornography, although there's certainly plenty of that. There is also a lot of bad science, inaccurate history, and lazy journalism on the internet. I don't want to have anybody base their research on the Drudge Report. He might be right occasionally, but if you fire enough bullets, you're going to hit occasionally. And every conspiracy nut seems to have his own web page. Teachers need to be comfortable enough with the computer and the internet to steer students to the good sites and away from the bad ones. Just as I received instruction in my teacher education programs on how to operate a mimeograph machine and film strip, if that doesn't date me, You know, remember when the tests stunk? You can always smell them. You have to go back a few hours. Future teachers need instruction on how to use computers in the classroom. A computer in every classroom is of little value if the teachers either don't know how or in some cases are actually afraid to use them. Finally, I think Kentucky needs to take a closer look at whether requiring teachers to earn master's degrees is the best way of assuring that teachers receive the knowledge and skills they need to excel. Instead of more method courses on the graduate level, it would seem wiser for classroom teachers to take more undergraduate content courses and to require teachers to complete so many continuing education requirements throughout their careers. Many teachers said they received little practical value from most of their graduate level courses. While expertise in the subject area is important, I would not want a child instructed by a qualified science or history teacher who has not received additional instruction in those fields in 10 or 20 years. Unfortunately, I think the schools of education at the regional universities are the biggest obstacles to changing the requirement that teachers earn master's degrees. It's not because that they think graduate degree programs are of great value, but because having a steady supply of teachers needing their master's gives them a steady stream of students. In short, changing the requirement would be like shooting the cash cow. However, I think schools of education would better serve teachers by designing continuing education courses that meet the needs of teachers. And I want to close with a personal note. Dr. Kleiber, one of the best teachers I ever had at Morehead State University. I had him in the very last history course I ever took. And I wish that I'd had him earlier because he knew how to teach the subject. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Eaglin said I should point out that I'm not Bill Bishop, and he works at the other end building from Holly and I. We are reporters, and there's a big difference between reporters and editorial writers, although I think sometimes the public is not aware of that. Having said that, I want to talk a little bit about our project, The Learning Gap, which took a look at teacher education in Kentucky and what we did and why we did it. Like Mr. Hopp said, everybody is an expert in education because we all had one, and we all know who our good teachers were. We all can remember exactly who they were, and unfortunately they're pretty few and far between, most people will say. The problem comes in trying to quantitatively say what makes a good teacher. We know the ones that got us excited and the ones that taught us a lot, but when you try and actually put those in terms that you can write about, it gets a little more difficult. To show you how difficult it was, the teacher education project had been in the works at the Herald Leader, or on the shelf at the Herald Leader, for I think 5 years before we got there. And suddenly we had three sort of, I guess, energetic education reporters and someone who was an expert in computer database reporting, who's Linda Johnson, who couldn't be here today. And so we knew that we needed to look at higher ed, K through 12, which I cover, and we were hoping that we could do a lot of computer-assisted reporting. We were fools because the state has very bad information on teachers, as has been everyone knows at this point. And after lots of wrangling with the Education Standards Board and with the Department of Education, we got a database of some 15,000 teachers who had been certified after 94? Yes. And so it was not everything that we had hoped, but we went from there. It was becoming clearer and clearer as we were working on this project that we kept reading these national stories about teacher education since Linda Darling Hammond and the National Commission on Teaching in America's Future, which I'm sure you all know about, came out. This has been a very, very hot topic in education. It's probably, I'd say, up there with school safety, really the biggest issue. And it became clear that this was something that really needed to be addressed in Kentucky too, because we had the sneaking suspicion that while everyone was focused on students because of the Kentucky Reform Act, that the same sort of emphasis had not been put on teachers, and the same scrutiny had not been given to teachers either. And one of the things that we first found as we started looking through some of the data was certification problems. Surprise to no one, because of problems with really grandfathered in middle school teachers. As you know, the certification has changed, and so you have a lot of generalists who are now teaching middle school. And people seem to feel that middle school teachers need to be better experts. They need to know more about the subjects that they're teaching. It's not enough for middle school teachers to be generalists anymore. And I think that that is something that is really picking up steam and is probably going to affect you all eventually. And when they talk about the middle school education program. The Department of Education doesn't always agree with national statistics from people like Richard Ingersoll, who was the one who first did a study on out-of-field teaching. For instance, Commissioner Cody doesn't think it's as much as 28% of science teachers in Kentucky that didn't major or minor in their field. But we'll let them argue that out. What they did find in an exhaustive hand-picked search through middle school transcripts, through the college transcripts of middle school teachers, they did find that nearly only 1 out of 4 teachers had actually either majored or minored in math, and 55% had never taken calculus. Now, I'm a journalist because I flunked math, and so I'm not going to make any kind of judgment calls about whether you need calculus to teach middle school math, but I think there are people out there who believe that you do, or at least that you ought to have tried it. So it was very clear that this was a problem. The Standards Board says that it has cut the number of emergency certified teachers in half. I believe that's true when you look at the numbers, but a lot of people may have certifications in different things, and they're still not teaching in field. So it's a very tricky issue. It's hard to get the real numbers out, and all that we need to know right now is that there is a problem with this. So what are you going to do if you have people who are not teaching in their field, who don't have the content knowledge that they need to give kids the depth that they need in this changing world that we live in? And since the average teacher has been teaching for 15 years, obviously you turn to professional development, which is a word we hear a lot about now. Kentucky was one of the first states to really get serious about professional development in terms of funding. When the Kentucky Education Reform Act passed, they started putting really unprecedented money into professional development. Now it's up to $23 per student, which is, when you go to other states, they are sort of amazed at that number. But as part of CARA, it went straight to the district, 65% to school councils to decide how to use it. And it became increasingly clear as we talked to teachers that there was no oversight of where this money was being spent, and there was no cohesive plan as to how teachers were getting their professional development. We then got very lucky and stumbled onto a study the department had done that found that 90% of that money was going to curriculum alignment, which luckily I don't need to explain, I hope, to people here, which is putting your what you're teaching in school, making sure it's in line with the state test, and no one doubts that needs to be done, but there seems to be great doubt as to whether that's what you should be spending your professional development money on, when instead you might be using it to pay for university classes or other really deep content knowledge that teachers appear to need. And that was something that we also, just to back up that data, Linda Johnson and I one day sat down and called, I think, about 30 different districts and said, "Hi, what are you spending? What are you doing for professional development this summer?" And they said, "Oh, we're doing curriculum alignment. It's going to be great." So it was not a fluke. That is something that people want to spend a lot of time and money on because naturally they have a very high stakes test that they need to do well on, but it's not considered really what they need right now. They need to be getting better content knowledge. And so, you know, that has become a big issue, and that's something that we looked at in the series as well. Now, there are a lot of good programs out there that are sort of starting to take hold. There's something called the National Faculty Program, which was going on at Berea this summer, and I went and sat in, and it was very intensive university-level math taught by university professors from different states and Kentucky to a group of Eastern Kentucky math teachers, and they got very intensive math instruction. Plus, they got the pedagogy to go along with it. And at this particular session, I got a stern lecture from a University of Louisville professor who said, "You newspapers, all you worry about is content, you know, and if you don't know how to teach it, it's not going to do any good." And so that is the joy of national faculty, which is that not only do these teachers get that kind of instruction that they need, but then they get better ways to learn how to impart it to their students. And then the best part of it is that the professors go to the districts after it's over, several months later, to make sure that the teachers know how to really incorporate it into their teaching. And that is something you hear all the time is, you know, your usual professional development, you go to a lecture you from someone on who knows what, and then you never worry about it again. You never then incorporate it into your classes. And so clearly there's going to have to be better follow-up. And that's something I think people are working on too. Clearly professional development is going to need better cooperation with higher education. Not a surprise, I think. I'm sure Commissioner Cody talked to you all about this when he was here. He said that there is a myth out there that you couldn't use professional development money for university-level classes, and that he's hoping to dispel that myth and set up some academies where you can actually get university classes. As has already been mentioned, the master degree issue is one that will have to be considered by lawmakers too, because Kentucky does have the highest number of teachers with graduate degrees in the Southeast, but whether those are of any value or whether they are, as someone described to us, Tuesday night degrees, whatever you can get on a Tuesday night, will have to be debated as well. There's lots coming down the pike, and we were happy that we could sort of get in at the beginning of this whole discussion in Kentucky. One thing, Kentucky's lucky because unlike a lot of other states, it is not facing a huge teacher shortage crisis in the sense that its population is not going to have huge jumps in the next 10 years. While it still has crises in the mountains in certain areas, it has the luxury of time to really concentrate on this issue of teacher education. There's many things going on. We were just down in Nashville at a session where we heard a lecture by Dr. William Sanders in Tennessee. I don't know if you all have heard of him, but he is the guru of value-added assessment, which means he takes test scores 3 years in a certain teacher's classroom, and with some incredibly complex statistical analysis that could not be explained to the general public, he figures out which teachers are effective and which teachers aren't. And this is something that is very, very, very controversial. And I think Dr. Sanders is coming to Kentucky to speak in the next few months. And so we'll see if that catches on here, or even whether we have test scores that could be used for that kind of analysis. We really tried in our series to point out good teachers and all the good things that are going on in Kentucky, because I think we get a lot of criticism for only pointing out the bad things in education, for only harping on bad teachers, for only whining and complaining and not offering any solutions. And I feel like we really tried hard to present both sides and to talk to people about what made a good teacher. And clearly, most teachers out there are working hard and doing well, and we were really trying to look at the systems that produce these teachers, you know, the praxis cutoff scores, the college admissions, the requirements once they're in the classroom. And I hope that came across as well, that there's a lot of people who are doing a really, really good job. There's another issue that's obviously going to be coming down the pike, we hope, which is the issue of teacher salaries. you hear a lot of anecdotal stories. Well, when I was in college, the kids who were in the teacher education program weren't as bright as the other kids, and that I don't know if that's true or not. But clearly, in order to attract better students, you're going to have to be able to pay them more. There is a program in Oldham County that is going to be starting up, whereby teachers would get salary supplements for professional development they do, especially if they get a certification from the National Board, which is considered the gold standard in teaching and is considered a really excellent professional development activity. That might be one way to address the issue. I'm not sure if the legislature is going to come up with $75 million for across-the-board teacher salary hike, but clearly it needs to happen. I would also, there's also something that's come up that people talk about, the political reality of raising standards. If we raise standards too much, we won't have any teachers in our classrooms. Well, there is that reality. We were at a speech at the Capitol by Barnett Berry, who is the assistant director of the National Commission on Teaching in America's Future. And he gave a very inspiring speech about raising the standards and the fact that if you raise the standards, people will meet them. It's what we're seeing with the Kentucky Education Reform Act every day with students, and there's no reason to assume that it won't be the same for teachers as well. Thank you.
As Linda said, the idea of looking at teacher quality had been percolating at the Herald Leader since the passage of the Kentucky Reform Act, Education Reform Act. There were a total of 9 education reporters, and there's 3 on the staff, one who covers the local school district, our state K-12 reporter, and myself, who covers higher education. It had been 9 reporters since 1990 that had been poking at our editors saying, this is a big deal. Kara did so much for our students, but are our teachers ready to handle the task of what Kara expects of them? And it requires them to teach a way that they weren't taught in, that they weren't taught by. Their classroom teachers didn't do what Kara asked of them. Their universities may not have been ready to teach them to deal with high-stakes testing. So when we first started looking at the learning gap, teacher preparation was a big part of what we looked at, what was going on in the colleges. And I will allow that after a while, I got tired of seeing Bill Bishop writing more about Moorhead than I did, and I'm the higher education reporter. So there was an emphasis for that, to find out whether what he was saying was it true. Is it happening at Moorhead or at Eastern or Northern or anyone else? And there are, every single university in the state has a college of education. Almost all of the private colleges have colleges of education. There are a lot of colleges of education going on in the state. So when looking at the colleges of education, I thought, oh God, how do I begin to get at this topic? One of the things that helped me really frame looking at the colleges of education was something that was said to me by Shirley Raines, who's the Dean of the College of Education at the University of Kentucky. She was one of the first interviews I did in trying to get my arms around this topic. She said to me, colleges of education and teacher preparation programs have the daunting task of unteaching the uninspired, the ineffective, in some cases the downright bad teaching. That they have to figure out a way to help students unlearn the 14 years of education they got from preschool to high school. They also have the task of helping students unlearn the education they got 2 years in general education, where if you're like me and you went to the University of North Carolina, you sat in an economics class with 400 other students, and your professor didn't know your name and couldn't care less whether you really passed the course or not. It's a challenge for the colleges to meet all those difficult tasks, and it's a subject that the public and their students are so intimately acquainted with. We all know our good teachers, we all know our bad ones too. So in looking at that topic, I framed what I was looking at in a couple of key areas. The first thing in looking at teacher preparation programs, I looked at admission standards to find out who's getting into these programs, who are the students who want to be our teachers, who sets the standards, Is there an entrance test? How soon can a student get into the program? Are they targeted as they're 18 coming out of high school and deciding they want to teach? Or are they the 20-year-old junior who's thinking, well, I don't know what else I'll do, maybe I'll be a teacher? I looked at where the colleges are meeting the admission standards and what happens to the students who don't meet that admission standards. And what I found by and large in Kentucky, that students, as set by the state, have to have a 2.5 in their general education requirements to get into the college, and about a 19 on the ACT, 21, depending on where you are. And by and large, Kentucky's colleges are meeting that. So I thought, well, that's pretty good. It's not as high as the engineering programs. It's not as high as maybe some of the pre-med students, but their standards clearly there. So I moved on to curricula to figure out, what are students learning? We looked at how much is dedicated to pedagogy, how much was in content, and who teaches the content. Or is it at UNC, they have this wonderful class, and it's called Statistics for Non-Majors, and that meant journalism majors. So it wasn't statistics for the people who really knew what they were doing. It was for those of us so we could do reports like this. I looked at, are the content courses the same rigor? I looked at, what were the requirements for elementary education? Those are the teachers who are often expected to be the jack of all trades. They've got to know everything. I looked at, what kind of method classes are going on, what kind of things are going on in technology. Are colleges still teaching people to, use film projectors or overhead slides, or are they using computers? What kind of things are helping the teachers out with discipline? Do they know how to handle, when theory goes out of the window, how to handle the student who won't stop talking? And I was one of those students when I was in school that wouldn't stop talking. How do you handle that? What I found at the colleges were that it's a mixed bag. It's hard to say if there's any one theory or one method of colleges that are providing all of that. The National Commission on Teaching in America's Future advocates, and as well as the Holmes Partnership, advocates a kind of a 4+1 theory, that all potential teachers should have a bachelor's degree in a content area and then 1 year of intensive, hard training within teaching. Only 2 of the universities in this state do that, and that's the University of Kentucky and the University of Louisville. Louisville has completely done away with this bachelor's program, whereas UK only offers bachelor's programs, but as well as master's with initial certification. It's not a mandate, but the thought is that it'll eventually move that way. Also, the partnership talked a great deal about professional development schools. Are students getting enough time in the classroom, in the trenches, seeing what students really look like, seeing the 13-year-olds that are going through all sorts of changes that really aren't interested in what you're telling them in front of the classroom? Only a handful of colleges have really strong, well-defined professional development programs. Morehead is one of them. The University of Louisville has probably the most extensive setup. I also looked at the education and school faculty. What were their qualifications? Most had PhDs. If they didn't have PhDs, in fact, I found very few programs that didn't have a majority of PhDs. But I also looked at whether they had been in the classroom, and many of them had not been in the classroom for a very long time in a sort of concentrated area. They'd been in the classroom to visit, to help out with their student teachers, to help out with teachers they knew in the public schools, but they actually hadn't been there from 7 to 3 for a very long time. I looked at the working relationships with the schools, and it really is a mixed bag from college to college. It's a mixed bag from professor to professor in college to college. Some professors, you can't keep them out of the classroom. They're constantly there trying to help their local school districts and offering their services. There are others who don't want to be there. I looked at how they taught. Did they do the things that they expected their students to do eventually when they're in the classroom? Did they lecture? Or did they actually, provide hands-on activities and discussion and all the things that we have now come to believe are good things for our students? And there, for the most part, education faculty are modeling good practices. They're using discussion, they're using teamwork, they're using hands-on practices to help their students get there. But unfortunately, those oftentimes come in the classes that are just about pedagogy and methodology. The calculus course that Linda taught about is taught by the gray-haired professor in the liberal arts campus who is content to sit there and lecture and scribble on a chalkboard. I looked at what kind of work do they do on professional development. For some, it's the master's courses that they teach in the summertime for teachers who have to have them. For others, you can't keep them out of the classroom. I also tried to look at student teachers and what student teaching is really like. Has anyone gone to this 4+1 model where it's it's akin to a teaching hospital, and whether you're getting that same sort of attention that you're there day by day? For the University of Kentucky and the University of Louisville, in a large degree, yes. At Scott County High School, there are several classes for their master's with initial certification that are taught at Scott County High School. So they have to deal with the 13-year-old who really doesn't want to be there. But I looked at where they're placed. Are they placed with the best possible teachers in their classrooms? It's hard to say. It's largely a matter of whether a teacher in a high school wants to take on a student teacher and wants to take on that responsibility, and whether they don't. And sometimes they may still get the teachers even if they don't want to take on a student teacher. I looked at how long it lasts. Is it long enough to help teachers get a real sense of all of the myriad of challenges that they'll face in the classroom? It's usually about a semester. Oftentimes it's in the classrooms that don't have the difficult problems that a new teacher will face, because oftentimes our new teachers, when they go into the classroom, get some of the hardest assignments. They get the children with a tremendous amount of baggage. They get the children who are hungry, who come from broken homes, who walk through all sorts of horrible neighborhoods to get to their schools. But their student teaching oftentimes tends to be with the students who are the best and the brightest, who want to get something out of it. For most student teachers I talk to, it tends to be a hard break to reality to go from a really positive student and teaching experience where kids want to learn and they're invigorated to the kids who you just simply don't know how to reach. I looked at how students get out of teacher preparation programs and how they gain that initial certification. The graduation rates for Kentucky's teacher education programs are high. Very few students don't make it through. And very few don't meet the requirements when they come out. Some self-select, but by and large, people who come in as sophomores or juniors tend to stay until they graduate. After we muddled through the absolutely horrendous data we got from the state, we found that very few of Kentucky's new teachers fail praxis tests, the core battery, or any of the specialty exams. We looked at it further and realized that Kentucky has some of the lowest cutoff scores in the nation. So it's a good thing that we're passing close to 90%. I looked at how are students prepared for exit exams? How are they prepared for the real life that when most of Kentucky's College of Education students go on to teach in Kentucky, how they're prepared for the real life in terms of knowing what CARA expects of them. Roger Pancratz has a great study every summer that says that while they've got a good grasp of, that every child can learn, and that's a good thing, when it comes down to the bolts of putting it all together, they're a little concerned. They don't know exactly how to implement portfolios into their learning. They don't know exactly how to get kids ready for CURIS, and CURIS is a hard test. They're not exactly comfortable with technology yet. I looked at where the grads go. Kentucky was set up on a regional university system, so largely the states, with the exception of the University of Louisville and the University of Kentucky, the students who come out of a particular program go back to that traditional service area, which means you oftentimes get the same cycle. You grow up going to school in the Painesville School District, you come to a college, and you go back to Painesville. I looked at what happens when they leave. The Kentucky has an internship program, but is there still that strong tie with their faculty in their colleges of education? It depends. It's a mixed bag. There are some faculty who make a point of following their students and making sure that they're there whenever they need the help and make sure that they get it. There are others who, once one group goes out the door, they're ready for the next group and they just ship them through. I looked at whether any of the universities were offering guarantees on their grads, or were they willing to go back and help the teachers that, for whatever reason, didn't get the skills they need. Every university in the state, all the public ones, offer a guarantee on their graduates. But by and large, they don't do much to check to make sure that the guarantee means anything. Western Kentucky was the first university to offer that guarantee, and I asked the dean there, well, how do you know whether it's working? Well, if we've got a problem, a principal will call us and tell us. Well, have you ever had a principal call and tell you? Well, no. Well, then how do you check? Well, we don't. It's really important to have those guarantees, but unless you know that you're monitoring the products that you produced, the guarantee may not be worth the paper it's written on. I looked at the new teachers, that once they've left these colleges, what's happening in internship programs. By and large, no new teacher fails the state's internship program. By and large, they get pretty high marks. And oftentimes, when new teachers are asked about their internship program, they have wonderful raves about the people who evaluated them, but they often can't say, here's a situation I had in my classroom that I didn't know how to handle, and they were able to give me the feedback. Well, I looked at where new teachers are placed. New teachers often get some of the toughest assignments in a school district. And they're often tossed into a school where there may or may not be a support system to help them deal with their tough assignments. And they may be in a school where everyone is much older than they are, and they've been teaching longer than they've been alive. And people are reluctant to change. And so when they come in with their bright new ideas about how things should be done, and this is a good idea, can we give this a try? It may not work, but can we try? They don't come into environments that are necessarily receptive to new ideas or to helping them sort through the education trends and the education success stories. And I also looked at the funding of teacher preparation programs. Every single state university has one. Almost all of the private colleges have one. And when you can go on a regional campus and you see no other classes being taught outside of the college education, you know that there's a certain fiscal value to those programs. We started this program we chose a somewhat inopportune time to begin the learning gap. We started in the summertime, so we had to play catch up in finding teachers in the classrooms in many cases, and students, non-graduate students in the colleges. But I didn't go on a campus where I didn't find education classes that weren't packed to the brim. Here at Morehead, here at the University of Kentucky, at Campbellsville, at Asbury, it brings in a lot of dollars. But when I look at the budgets, it's hard to see that whether all the dollars that those students bring in come back to those programs to give them the support that they need. They often have the smallest faculty. Education faculty are paid far less than their counterparts in chemistry, physics, engineering, and some of the hard sciences. They're on par with some of the liberal arts, but they don't certainly command the salaries that English professors and history professors sometimes command. We looked at how the budget sits and how it compares with big ticket programs. And we all looked at whether there's any sort of incentive in the state for any sort of performance funding. Is doing a good job. Is it simply pass rates? Or is there, does it look at what your college graduates are doing 2 years down the road when they're in the classroom? Kentucky is only beginning to now look at that issue. And I also looked at the fact of whether in a state this size, do you really need 25 plus teacher preparation programs? And when a job is as important as teachers, shouldn't only your best and brightest be teaching teachers? Are the students at small colleges like Asbury, where there's only about, in a good year, there's maybe 35 people in teachers preparation program, are they at a disadvantage? Because when there's only 35, are they getting the best of everything they need? The state hasn't yet begun to address those questions. There are a lot of solutions and a lot of talk in the state now going on about what can be done about teacher preparation. However, in looking at this report, the thing that we came to the kind of consensus is that it can't be done without collaboration. It has to be a P16 through F effort, because colleges can often teach the things that they think are important, but they may not be the things that teachers need to succeed in the classroom. I can offer an example from journalism. My first news writing class at what David says is one of the colleges of journalism in the nation, my first writing class, I learned to write the inverted pyramid. I can't tell you how many times, I can count on one hand, the number of times working at the Herald Leader and at any internship I had where I actually wrote a story in the inverted pyramid. But this is what's from a university that's thought to have one of the strongest journalism programs in the nation. For looking at teachers, it was hard for us, as Linda pointed out, just because teachers have the hardest job and one of the most important jobs in this country. I come from a family of educators. My mother taught high school for 18 years. She now teaches at the university level. I have an aunt who works in the Department of Education. I have an uncle who teaches high school in Gary, Indiana. I have another uncle who taught 35 years at the university level. The standard for looking at this project for me personally was, would my mom still speak to me after I wrote this? I'm glad to say that she still does. And she criticized some points and said I should have done this and I should have looked at that, but she still does. And that gives me the confidence to know that this is an important topic for this state and that the media has a big role to play in informing people about this topic, getting beyond the warm fuzzies of teachers who gave you a hug every day and made you feel great, but getting into some of those other more quantifiable things. And not to belittle the teachers who give hugs every day, because that's a great thing, because there are many days that we all had in schools where we could really use that hug. But we have to be able to move beyond, and I think this was the consensus that we heard from everyone we talked to, beyond those intangibles and look at the nuts and bolts that go into making good teachers. Thank you.
We will now take a 5-minute recess. Stretch, very good. Well, welcome back, everyone. Now's the time where we have the opportunity to ask our panel of experts questions so they can give us their opinions, and I have the prerogative of asking the first question, and I'd like to read it, and anyone who would like to respond may, and if you have the real urge to respond, just speak up. If not, let someone else do it. If none of you want to do it, we're in a lot of trouble. Based upon your coverage of causes and contributing factors for either poor student performance or inadequate classroom teaching, is there any consensus by the general public as far as you're concerned, as where the blame should be assigned, and if so, to whom?
I'm not sure that the general public necessarily sees the quality of teachers as being, despite our efforts, a huge problem yet. I think in many cases, unless if their kid has okay teachers, that's good enough then. If their kid has a really inadequate or inefficient or whatever bad teacher a year, then it becomes a huge problem on their radar screen. So I don't know if the public as of yet has a sense of who's to blame. Traditionally, among policymakers and politicians and education experts, there's a round of finger pointing. The colleges will say, well, the high schools aren't sending enough quality students to work with. And principals and superintendents will say, well, you're not producing enough quality teachers to help us send you quality teachers. So there's been a round of finger pointing, I think, traditionally.
And I think the problem is the teachers think everyone's blaming them, and that's a real problem. For us, there's a lot of, I think they perceive us as the enemy, and they feel like they are the ones getting all the blame from everyone, from the media, from parents, from the policymakers, and that's not really true, but I think the perceptions are really out there, and we're going to have to work hard to change it.
I think there's a lot of blame to go around, and it's fun to point the fingers at somebody else. Teachers put a lot of blame on parents and the lack of parent involvement. But there's also a time parents will say that they don't feel welcome in schools. They don't want the teachers will tell them what their kids need to learn, and they don't want their input. So I think that there is a problem with home life, and that there's so many single parents, and there's also a lot of homes where there's not a single book in the home. Parenting is turning on the TV at 6 o'clock at night and shutting it off at 11 and hope to get something of value in that. And that's a problem. But in teacher education, I think there's still a perception that those who can do and those who don't teach. And I think there's still a perception also that, well, I may not teach, but I want to get my teaching degree because it's something to fall back on. It's not what they really want to do, but they fall back on it. And the good teachers are the ones that go in and want to do it. And pride is still the most important aspect in any job.
I think most people say that, Congress is a bunch of jerks, except my congressperson's pretty good.
Yeah.
Now, I don't say that in my particular case, but I think most people do say that. I think the same thing applies to public perception of teaching. I think there's sort of a vague unease, a vague dissatisfaction to some degree with teaching, but most people are happy with their own students' in classroom instruction. And unfortunately, as a result, I don't think teacher preparation is on the radar screen, despite the good work done by the Herald Leader, despite the attention being given to it by the long-term policy group, by the Pritchard Committee, and by many others. And the governor. I really don't think it's there yet. I don't think it's perceived as a major problem. I think the major problem that people associate with education in Kentucky is the problem that we participate in this sort of national unease about discipline and values. And I think if we were to probe very deeply among our readers. I think that would emerge as the biggest concern that folks have, not teacher preparation and not teacher performance. One final thing I would say is that the problem among those who are aware and among those on whose radar screens this issue does occupy a significant position, the way they look at it depends on where they are. If you're in eastern Kentucky, your view of this problem is different than the view that you would have of the problem in Louisville. Louisville's dilemma has to do with the imposition of a choice system in an urban setting where you move a lot of people around and the creation of several educational ghettos. And I'm not talking about racial ghettos, I'm talking about socioeconomic ghettos, basically. The problem in eastern Kentucky is very different from that. As a result, Tom Gish is talking about a different crisis in eastern Kentucky when he's talking about that gap expanding between high-achieving systems, Anchorage and Big Creek Elementary. He's talking about a different problem than the problem that we're talking about in Louisville when we talk about the fabulous Manual High School, but then a Western high school, which is just a disaster area, losing, half of its students in the past 5 or 6 years because it's not a good choice. So it's very difficult, I think. I think when you talk about the problems that are on the radar screen, you have to know where you are when you're talking about it.
We'll now have some questions from our audience and from our panel. To our panel.
I'm Donna Everett, College of Business, and I'm on the steering committee, and I have a question. In what ways might you and your respective newspapers help in the effort to attract a larger number of better qualified individuals to the teaching profession in general, but also more minority teachers, science and mathematics teachers, and special ed?
Well, let me say very quickly, I'll just offer a couple things and then pass it on. 2 things that newspapers can do are to create diverse staffs. The natural result of having a diverse staff is that you tend to cover a larger and more diverse part of the community, and that includes role models. That's my conviction. I think a diverse recruiting and retaining and promoting a diverse staff, I think we'll do that. People with a broad range of interests and backgrounds. Secondly, mainstreaming those people, those role models, into coverage that whose work you want to emphasize, whose existence you want to recognize and emphasize, is fundamentally important. So I think those 2 things are simple things that we can do.
I can understand the problems of school districts in our area getting diversity among their teachers, because we've had a real problem with that at the Independent, finding diversity among our reporters. We are not a very diverse community. We're pretty much a white Protestant community, as most of eastern Kentucky is, and it's hard to attract minorities, and once you attract them, it's hard to keep them. And the school systems have the same problem. And so I can understand that, but I think the way the newspapers can help is to create balanced reporting. I mean, we're great at, of course, people remember the negative stories. They don't remember the positive stories. We have a lot of positive stories on it. We did a 40-inch.
I keep a drawer of
yeah.
those. I keep a drawer of positive stories. And when those snots call up and say,
Yeah.
"You never print anything nice about anybody," I open the drawer and I just start reading story after story that we've done that's positive.
We did a 40-inch story a few weeks ago on Governor's Cup results. And the result of that is we got a very negative letter from a teacher who said we didn't commend the volunteers that worked so hard to get there, and we treated it too much like a baseball game, because we pointed out which schools won, and we forgot about the individuals that also won. And you go, and I remember a letter to the editor last year. Of course, sports is big. Boyd County High School thinks that we sit around every morning and think, how can we cut them down today? And I got a letter to the editor from a student out there that said we never one time have we ever featured their football games on the front page of the Saturday sports section. Instead of writing the letter, I went and got 6 consecutive Saturdays in which we had the front Boyd County football game on the front page of the Saturday sports section. And I just sent back a note and said, "What newspaper are you reading?" But that's not a whole lot about education. But I think we try to positive show teachers. I mean, show that teachers are committed. But there's a jealousy too there. I mean, we have some teachers that have gotten national awards, and some of the other teachers are really jealous of them because those teachers tend to be self-promoters. Well, self-promotion is not too bad. So somebody's got to do it, and most of the time it has to be you. But that's one of the problems, in that there's a lot of jealousy among the teaching profession too.
I would say we can just keep pointing out the need and what the situation is. The need for minority teachers, the need for more science and math teachers, the fact that there has only ever been one African American superintendent in Kentucky, the fact that there's only 4% African American administrators and 4% African American teachers. I think that if we keep pointing that out, then people realize what the problem is, and hopefully they can, and then the editorial page can tell them what they need to do about it. And I mean, every time I've written a story on alternative certification, which was a big subject earlier this fall, every time I wrote a story, someone would call me and say, "Now, how do I do that? I just read your story about I'm a chemist in such and such, and I want to be a high school teacher." And I do believe that is the way that we can hopefully try and solve the problem a little bit.
I think we also have to, in showing the good side of teaching, we also have to show the bad side, because everyone's an expert in everything. And then I read the paper myself and I think, well, if they just did that, solve this problem. And I think that's sometimes a good thing to appeal to, that when you see things going, we wrote a story back in the fall before the school district race in Fayette County that saying, guess what, there's not a darn soul running for school board. 3 days later, they had 5 candidates. And it wasn't a positive story saying that people weren't running for school board, but it motivated people to do that. And I think in addition to telling the good stories, like I said, we made a decision at the front end of doing the learning gap that we would do the pages every day that say, what is a good teacher? And try to engage our readers to say, who was the teacher who got it done for you? Who meant the most to you, and tell us why? But at the same time, we have to write those stories saying that nobody's running for school board, or there's not enough science teachers in Jessamine County, or whatever, because I think those sort of same things motivate people to act.
We have to come on up. This will be short. We have to steel ourselves to the attitude that people exhibit toward reading a newspaper. It doesn't bother me anymore. I went to the trouble to write a column out of the state tournament about Barron County High School, which had the misfortune of drawing Scott County in the first game. And I analogized their success this year in basketball to their success finally after years of struggling with the consolidation of all those high schools in Barron County. And I did a lot of reporting for this column. I really worked hard on the column. I spent 2 or 3 days working on it. And the only letter that I got for the first day or two was a letter from some hateful woman in Cave City who said, "Well, you didn't even get the name of the girl who had the National Merit Scholarship right. She must have been devastated." And so I went back, picked up my materials, looked at it. I was right based on the information the school gave me, and I handed it off to one of my executive assistants because I wouldn't have been capable of calling this woman. I would have said something that I didn't really want to say. People, that's the way people read us, I mean, the people are really, and in a way that's good. This turned out not to be so short. We are much more credible than TV. That's a fact. And so people expect much more from us than they do from broadcast news. So, we just have to steel ourselves to that and move forward.
I'm Debbie Grubb. I'm representing the College of Education and Behavioral Sciences on the steering committee. And I have a question. What do you, the panel, think is different between the teacher education roles of the regional universities and the research universities, UK and U of L?
This is something I'm struggling with, and the state's struggling with, as it puts more emphasis on post-secondary education and making the universities unique and strong in national programs. There is one school of thought that the regional universities should no longer be all things to all people. They should focus on the things they do really well and do those things. And that the same thing should go on at the UK and U of L, that they should focus on their research mission and focus on providing a solid undergraduate training, but really strong research universities. I think that's a very hard call, because the mission of the regional universities and their efforts to try to call them comprehensive universities and get out of the idea of being regional, comprehensive universities, to want to serve their areas so much that they have everything and they try to do everything and be everything. I think it's hard for them to struggle with that in general, and I think it's even harder to look at when it comes to teacher education. U of L has made a concentrated effort. They decided that what we're going to do is masters. We're not going to bother with the bachelor's programs. We're going to do Masters of Arts in Teaching, but Jefferson County schools are screaming their heads off. We don't have enough bodies for our classroom. They decided, we're sorry. We're going to focus on masters. There's efforts among Commissioner Cody and Dr. Davies of the Council on Post-Secondary Education to look at Kentucky teacher academies, that at teacher prep programs to set up strong programs where this college will do the best job in this, and we'll fund them to do the best job in this. A similar approach to what they've done in their regional university excellence funds and the Research Challenge Trust funds for the state, for the universities at large. But I don't have an answer to that, and I don't think anyone in the state has quite figured out what to do about that yet. But I think there is a tendency at all the universities, and sometimes particularly maybe at the comprehensive universities, to try to be all things to all people and do everything. And that can spread you thin. I mean, we've all had that experience.
This is really Holly's area of expertise and not mine. I would speak more as a just general member of the public on this issue, in a sense that I think there is a perception out there in sort of policy education land that UK and U of L are better schools because they have put the emphasis on the master's degree on the 5-year program rather than the sort of general education degree. Now, as I said, that is just what I hear. It is not based on anything, except our series,
Except for our politicians.
And our politicians, yeah, and so I just feel that and maybe that's just urban versus rural as well. There's probably some bias there as well. And because we live in Lexington and see the Fayette County teachers, most of whom come from UK. So that would just be the general airy perception out there.
I'm not real familiar with UK and U of L's graduate programs. I do think there's a trend to, we're in a period of flux here where each school, UK and U of L and all the regional universities, are figuring out what it is they want to do. And I think it is going to be smaller areas, but what they do is do well. And I think Moorhead has a long tradition of doing a good job of training teachers. The reason I went to Moorhead State University, I'm not from this region. I grew up in Washington Courthouse, Ohio. But it was 2 high school teachers that both graduated from Moorhead that had me helped me in my decision to come here. And I came to Moorhead with the intent of becoming a history teacher. And it was a good enough university to show me that I had better skills.
I think UK ought to be out of the teacher preparation business. I think the regionals, the comprehensive institutions ought to do teacher preparation, ought to do our teacher preparation, our professional preparation. My great conviction is that this state deserves to have one front rank, terminal degree granting institution whose scholarship and research, as a more general proposition, really will propel it legitimately into the front rank as a research one. If UK consumes itself with professional, or in the case of journalism, vocational preparation, I think it is not emphasizing those things that it ought to do.
And just as one addendum, I think there is a thought that who UK and U of L serve, in lack of a better term, is not the masses. They're not providing teachers to Breathitt County. They're providing teachers to Fayette County and Jefferson County. And by and large, that's where their graduates go, except for the handful of students that come from Western Kentucky, South Central Kentucky, and want to go back home, Eastern Kentucky, and want to go back home. That's not who they're serving. So there is a question about whether, can the state afford to operate two colleges of education that serve just two counties, by and large?
The state would do better to buy the services of, say, Spalding, in my view, than to have the University of Louisville expend a whole lot of energy, if it were in fact doing that, on undergraduate level teacher preparation. Now, they're not doing that, so that's not an issue. But there are ways in which, in a place like Louisville, you can utilize the empty seats at existing private institutions, and we don't do enough of that in this state, in my view.
I'm Thomas Klein, and I'm on the steering committee representing the College of Science and Technology. And this question is to anyone, and it says, great inflation has been national and not just in Kentucky. What do you think about the recent movement of Eastern Kentucky University to curb this trend?
My personal impressions when I got that story, when I started working that story that I wrote last Saturday about EKU's initiative to control grade inflation, first of all, I was amazed that they didn't have plus and minus. I thought, well, why wouldn't you? Because my college experience included that. I think those are all probably very good initiatives and begins to address the problems. But one of the things that I heard, and unfortunately, as all the best things I hear are off the record, I heard from a lot of people I interviewed for that story was the fact that professors have standards for their classes, but for whatever reason, because of whatever pressure they get from their fellow professors, from students who apparently have a lot more moxie than I did, and to go to a professor and say, you know what, this grade's wrong. I was amazed by that when they told me how many times students came up to them and said, you need to change this grade. I'm thinking, there's no way I would have ever done that to any professor I had at UNC. I would have been too terrified to do that. But there's a lot of pressure to weaken their standards. That work the previous year that would have been an A that would have been just a C, becomes a B+ work because of all the different things that come in with students doing surveys that factor into your tenure, students having more moxie to come and argue with you about your grades and why you graded the way you did. And a lot of the thoughts for some are the idea that if have the standards and stick to them and not waver on them, and if that means half your class gets C's and D's, half your class gets C's and D's, and have administrators that stick behind you and by that. So I think while these begin to get at the point, a lot of people think that standards that you don't waver on will solve a lot of the problem, because students who want the A's and B's so they can get into graduate school are going to have to work harder to get the A's and B's when they realize that they can't fudge their way around them.
I only have the lower ed perspective, and I don't know if you're interested in that. Well, anyway, I think, in fact, I'm working on a story, sort of, which I'm sure. about a school. Apparently, there's a high school out there that is changing from having valedictorian and salutatorian to cum laude and summa cum laude because they have so many valedictorians. And yeah, yeah, and they just and I think that this has always been an issue in lower ed, and it's more of an issue now that they have the Commonwealth scholarships. It's going to only get bigger. So
It's also more of an issue because this is a generation of yuppie parents who cannot conceive of their child making anything other than a B or an A. They make me want to vomit.
I'll let David take the floor now.
No,
It's way more.
I agree with you. I mean, it is an issue in secondary education. It's a big
Yeah.
issue. Grade inflation is a reality. All you have to do. I mean, I'm called upon to give a lot of graduation speeches, and there are 15 valedictorians across. Everybody's got a 4-point. Well, you can't get a 4-point. I mean, you can't have 15 people who get a 4-point.
Yeah, and they've taken,
Not if people are implying real standards.
right,
I mean,
and not if if one person's taking all AP classes and the other one's taking
exactly.
art
Exactly.
and band.
And parents game the system. They will drag their children out of the AP class if there's the slightest possibility that they're not going to get an A.
And that mindset clearly transfers to college.
And I think that's one of the things that colleges are struggling with.
I will
that
say,
students have become more grade oriented, that it is that bottom line of grades and less of the learning and the experience and the growth that goes on. And I'm not sure any colleges have got a real handle on how to begin to deal with that.
One of the great things about portfolios, one of the great, overwhelming, wonderful things about a portfolio is that there are limited ways in which you can game the portfolio. When you look at what somebody writes, their thinking is paradigmed for you on the paper, and their skill level is there in the portfolio. And so to the extent that colleges begin to use portfolios more extensively in choosing freshman classes, I think it's a good thing.
We have reached our point of reversal and would like to applaud you for the questioning session from the audience to our panel, and we are now going to allow you to ask questions of the partners in education in our audience.
in regards to the grade inflation, when I mentioned Dr. Kleiber earlier, mispronounced his name, but it's been 30 years. But I wrote a column when he wrote the Kentucky history. He was the editor of that, about what my experience with him in class. And he was a very difficult, very demanding teacher. He wrote me back a letter saying that his students today, he couldn't teach that course today because the students wouldn't produce. And that bothered me a whole lot, because I think that you should, the most valuable classes I had as a student were the ones that worked me the hardest. Didn't think that at the time. I mean, I hated some of them. Julia Webb in debate was, whew, but very, very valuable. And I think you need to, I was always worried about my grade point average. So I worked, but I'm not exactly sure what they mean by grade inflation, but I think there's going to be a real problem with the Kentucky Commonwealth Scholarship, because an A at DuPont may not be the same as an A at Elliott County High School. So I'm curious, do you see a problem with demanding from your students as much as you could 20 years ago? Will they produce?
Don't all jump up at once now.
Vigorously nod.
Yeah, there's.
Francine Botts Butler, Director of Multicultural Student Services. I noticed one thing that is different from when I was in school about 20, 30 years ago. They don't do as much writing as we had to do when I was a freshman in college. So I think that is a problem. You can't assign the 10 to 20 page papers that I had to write. Now if they get 1 to 2 pages, they think that's too much.
That's really interesting, since
Yeah.
You know, in elementary and secondary, we're preparing them in exactly the opposite direction.
Yeah, that's surprising to me, and it makes me wonder what, you know, I guess everything that we see about portfolios is not really transferring.
I was
What?
I was interested in your comment about pressures being placed upon professors to give A's. I hope that's not true here. I can't speak with all candor on that subject, but
Well, students pressure you. I can verify that.
but
I
if-
teach and I get pressures.
Oh,
And I'm like you. I wouldn't have thought about going to one of my professors to pressure them over one of my grades. Wouldn't have considered it.
I guess my point here is that an institution does not have to succumb to student pressure nor administrative pressure if they do not wish, because I see too many at the end of the line in terms of grievance, and I can't recall one time in 30 years of overturning a grade that a professor has given. So I think that if this has been allowed, there's been some kind of a cultural something that's kind of weaved its way in that I'm unaware of.
I think it comes from
and if
below,
it's
as
true
you
out
said.
there, I think at least this gives me an opportunity to say to our faculty that, you know, that's what you're hired for, is to make the tough decisions on how to evaluate the performance of students. That's what your expertise is.
One of the things I'm curious to know is we're expected at the Herald Leader. It's a very lucky paper. We're very fortunate to work there. That this paper has made such a commitment to education. A paper of our size that has 3 full-time education reporters who write about education all the time is, you know, it's unheard of for a paper this size, and we're lucky about that. But it's really hard for all of us to be experts on all things at all times. What do you guys see as our weaknesses in terms of, and now granted, I'll caveat that saying that, you know, we circulate in 90 counties, you know, we're writing for a whole sort of different audience, for the professors in Lexington, for the professors in Moorhead, but for Joe Sixpack in whatever county who may not, you know, I've got to write stuff in a way that if he decides to read my story about college funding formulas, which I really doubt that he did, that he can understand it, you know. What do you see in our weaknesses in terms of education coverage, and what are the issues and topics that we should probably be talking about that we haven't, or that we've only superficially talked about?
Now you've opened the floodgates.
Or are we doing a great job and you're really happy?
Go ahead.
Here they come.
I'm Lane Calstert in the Agriculture Science Department, and I think y'all kind of face the same problems that we do in education. Let's say when I started in education, the content was very important, but the content or the technical information that I was being taught to go out and teach might be the same for 10 years. Now that content is changing so fast, I tell my students what you learn as a freshman will not be of benefit to you when you graduate as a senior. All right, now let's go into that. What ability or technical knowledge did a teacher need 30 years ago when computers were not there? So they not only have to know the content that's turning over real fast, they have to know how to use all of the tools and gadgets that's available to them out there. And then you look at assessment. I wonder the hours that a teacher spends on assessment today as compared to 30 years ago. And then you say that our students can't do what students could do 30 years ago, and I think there's a big problem we need to look at in education.
I'll say something about what you report on. I will say this, that I've been in 4 states. I've been in small markets, large markets. I've been in electronic markets. And I've always been in a position where I was a focal point, at least, of questions. And I'm not saying this to suck up at all. I do think that
Okay, though.
I do think that you handle most things even-handedly. What I sensed from your comments is that you're all humans just like us. I knew that before I even said that, and before I met some of you. But the key here, is that Lane's exactly right. We're all living in a high sense of frustration, mainly because things are reported so quickly there isn't really time to think through. People want solutions almost immediately. We're criticized because we are slow moving. But, you know, it took a long time for the academy, the most revered academy in the world, higher education in the United States, and our philosophy of educating everyone in some form of post-secondary education, that we do not move quickly. And it's probably good that we don't move real fast, because I think sometimes hasty movement creates problems that we may never be able to recover from. And I guess if I had any criticism, I think that sometimes the papers do reflect why aren't they moving faster, quicker, or in some cases maybe not at all, which I don't think any of you believe that we're not moving not at all. So it's a tough, frustrating business, and it's a serious business, because everything we do affects your children and their children's children.
If you think you're frustrated, imagine the frustration of the NATO staff who are being asked today, you mean we haven't brought Milosevic to heal? I mean, we've been bombing for 2 days.
It's been 10 minutes at least.
And the reporters, these are the same reporters who asked General Schwarzkopf, what is the day and date of departure from the line of march? And I mean, we are in a crazy craft. It's a crazy craft.
Well, that would be the only concern I would have as a person who's been in this for a long time. And I'm not in the classroom. These are the experts who are in the classroom. They see students every day. I see them every day, but in a different role. And I respect sometimes the care that they take with the curriculum, even though I may disagree. It's a matter of respect.
I think different teachers can create different kinds of epiphanies, but the great teachers are the ones who, in one way or another, create epiphanies. And I've just never understood where in the teacher preparation process you discover that a candidate for your profession is capable of doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I wanted to comment on what President Eaglin. I'm Michael Moore. I'm Vice President for Academic Affairs here at Morehead State. And having been in at least 2 other states prior to coming here as well, that's been my sense of the fairness that I think the President saw in the reporting here. For the most part, I think it's been fairly even-handed, even though the ones that are negative we tend to focus on more because they hurt the most. But I think for the most part they brought out issues that we need to be concerned with. And I wanted to also comment on the point that we were just making too about how quickly we expect responses. And I'm going to have to ask my colleagues to help me here. But when we talked about the issue of writing, and it was expressed that our students aren't writing as much, and the incongruence of that between what Kira was trying to do, my sense is, though, that that's only very, very recently that any of the students would be coming to us who have had an emphasis on portfolios. Is that not the case? So we shouldn't be seeing very much yet. Hopefully we will, is my sense. But again, I guess I'm trying to say we all tend to buy into that too much of, well, we've been doing this, why don't we have the result right away? And I think we're expecting that ourselves sometimes with regard to such issues as writing.
I'm Dan Fasko, I'm the interim chair of leadership in secondary ed, and I'd like the media to actually change the perception, I think, of legislators and others around that think that we only teach 12 hours a week. My wife said I miscalculated when we did our workload that I worked for only 60 hours, and she said I did more than 60, but I think those kinds of perceptions need to be changed. And I welcome the media to come into any of my classrooms and work with my faculty and go to their classes.
Hear, hear. I'm one of you.
I don't think Wallace Wilkerson thought you taught that much.
Well, we've come to the end of our hour, and I've also lost my notes on how to end this session, which is probably fitting since this is the last time we're going across the state. But I do want to thank our panelists, and I wish you would have joined me and saying and showing our appreciation for them taking time from very busy schedules to be here. Thank the rest of you, and good evening from Morehead State University.
Maybe it's mine. That's probably